Regime change rhetoric fuels global instability because it transforms political disagreements into existential confrontations. When powerful leaders publicly call for the removal of another country's leadership, the message is not received as diplomacy, but as a threat to sovereignty. This immediately hardens positions on all sides. Governments targeted by such language interpret it as preparation for intervention, whether economic, political, or military. As a result, they shift resources toward defense, tighten internal control, and prioritize security over social development. What begins as a statement becomes a catalyst for arms buildup, alliance formation, and regional polarization, creating ripple effects far beyond the original dispute. Historically, regime change narratives have followed a predictable pattern. They are often framed as moral missions, presented to domestic audiences as necessary actions to protect freedom or stability. Yet in practice, they have repeatedly produced chaos, power vacuums, and prolonged conflict. When external actors attempt to redesign political systems from the outside, they ignore local realities, social structures, and historical grievances. This mismatch leads to fragile governments, contested legitimacy, and cycles of unrest. Instead of stability, the result is prolonged uncertainty that spreads across borders through refugee flows, disrupted trade routes, and regional insecurity. Another critical consequence of regime change rhetoric is its impact on global diplomatic norms. International relations rely on the principle that states, regardless of size or power, have the right to self determination. When influential nations openly challenge this principle, they weaken the foundation of international cooperation. Smaller countries begin to question whether international law truly protects them or whether it is selectively applied. This erosion of trust makes multilateral agreements harder to sustain and encourages nations to rely more on military strength than on diplomacy, further destabilizing the global order. Domestically, such rhetoric also serves political purposes. Leaders often use external threats to rally public support, distract from internal economic challenges, or consolidate power. By framing international politics as a battle between good and evil, complexity is reduced to slogans and public debate becomes emotional rather than analytical. This environment makes compromise politically risky and rewards aggressive posturing over constructive negotiation. The international stage becomes a theater where bold statements gain attention, while quiet diplomacy is sidelined. The economic impact cannot be ignored. Regime change discourse frequently triggers sanctions, trade restrictions, and financial isolation. These measures disrupt global markets, increase energy price volatility, and strain supply chains. While policymakers frame these tools as strategic pressure, the burden often falls on civilians who experience inflation, unemployment, and reduced access to essential goods. At the same time, defense industries and security contractors profit from rising tensions, reinforcing a system where instability becomes economically rewarding for a select few. When such rhetoric becomes normalized, it creates a dangerous feedback loop. Each hostile statement invites a stronger response. Each response justifies further escalation, and the space for dialogue steadily shrinks. Over time, confrontation becomes the default setting of international politics, shaping policies, media narratives, and public perception in ways that make peaceful resolution increasingly difficult. Geopolitical power struggles benefit elites, not citizens, because the structures of global politics are designed to protect influence and profit rather than public well being. When governments engage in high level confrontations, the decisions are made in closed rooms by political leaders, corporate stakeholders, and military planners. Ordinary people are not present at these tables, yet they absorb the consequences. While leaders speak about national pride and strategic victory, families face rising living costs, shrinking job opportunities, and increased uncertainty about the future. One of the clearest examples of this imbalance is the role of the military industrial sector. Escalating tensions lead to higher defense budgets, expanded weapons production, and long term government contracts. These industries benefit from prolonged rivalry because conflict, or even the threat of conflict, guarantees consistent demand. At the same time, public funds that could support education, healthcare, housing, and infrastructure are redirected toward military spending. Citizens are told this sacrifice is necessary for security, yet the everyday realities of insecurity, poverty, inadequate public services, and economic inequality remain unresolved. Economic sanctions provide another illustration of how elites remain insulated while ordinary people suffer. Political leaders and wealthy individuals often have access to alternative financial systems, foreign assets, and private networks that protect them from the full impact of economic pressure. Meanwhile, workers experience currency devaluation, inflation, and reduced access to basic goods. Small businesses struggle to survive, and young people face limited career prospects. The intended political leverage rarely translates into meaningful reform, but it consistently produces widespread social hardship. Media narratives also play a role in maintaining this imbalance. Coverage of geopolitical conflict often focuses on dramatic statements, military movements, and national rivalries, turning complex economic and social consequences into background noise. This framing creates emotional engagement without encouraging deeper understanding. Citizens are mobilized around symbolic victories rather than practical outcomes, while structural problems such as wage stagnation, healthcare access, and education inequality remain unaddressed. Political leaders benefit from this environment as well. External conflict provides a convenient distraction from domestic challenges. By emphasizing threats from abroad, governments can reduce scrutiny of corruption, policy failures, and economic mismanagement. National unity is promoted through fear rather than through shared progress, and criticism is sometimes labeled as unpatriotic. This dynamic strengthens those in power while weakening democratic accountability. At the international level, powerful nations and multinational corporations often shape the rules of trade, finance, and resource access in ways that preserve their advantage. Strategic partnerships and economic agreements are negotiated to secure influence and profit, not necessarily to improve living standards for working populations. Natural resources, energy markets, and transportation routes become tools of leverage, while local communities face environmental damage, labor exploitation, and displacement. The result is a global system where confrontation is profitable for a small group and costly for the majority. Citizens become spectators to decisions that reshape their lives, paying the price through taxes, lost opportunities, and reduced social stability, while those at the top continue to operate within protected political and economic circles. Double standards weaken international credibility because they expose a gap between what powerful nations claim to represent and how they actually behave. When governments publicly champion democracy, human rights, and the rule of law while selectively applying these principles, they undermine the moral authority of the very values they promote. Other countries, especially those that have experienced intervention or political pressure, quickly recognize this inconsistency. As a result, international norms begin to appear less like universal rules and more like tools of convenience used by those with the greatest influence. This selective application is visible in how different conflicts are treated on the global stage. Some violations of international law trigger immediate condemnation, sanctions, and diplomatic isolation, while others are ignored or excused due to strategic alliances. When accountability depends on political alignment rather than objective standards, the legitimacy of global institutions is weakened. Smaller nations start to question whether international organizations truly serve collective interests or whether they function as extensions of dominant geopolitical power. Double standards also distort public perception. Citizens in powerful countries are often presented with simplified narratives that frame certain actions as necessary or justified while condemning similar actions by rivals. This creates an environment where critical thinking is replaced by loyalty based interpretations of global events. Over time, this erodes public trust not only in foreign policy, but also in domestic political leadership, as contradictions become increasingly visible through independent media and global communication networks. For countries on the receiving end of these inconsistencies, the impact is particularly severe. When leaders see that rules are unevenly enforced, they are less likely to cooperate with international agreements. Why comply with restrictions, inspections, or transparency measures if others are not held to the same standards? This dynamic encourages strategic defiance and reduces incentives for compromise. Instead of strengthening cooperation, double standards promote a competitive mindset where nations prioritize self protection over collective problem solving. Economic consequences also follow. Trade policies, sanctions, and financial regulations are frequently applied unevenly, favoring allies and penalizing rivals. This disrupts fair competition and creates unstable markets. Businesses operating in affected regions face uncertainty, while consumers experience price fluctuations and supply shortages. The global economy becomes more fragmented, driven by political loyalty rather than efficiency or mutual benefit. At the diplomatic level, inconsistency damages long term relationships. Trust is the foundation of negotiation, and when partners suspect hidden agendas or unequal treatment, meaningful dialogue becomes difficult. Agreements are approached with skepticism, and cooperation is replaced by transactional bargaining. This weakens collective efforts to address global challenges such as climate change, public health crises, and humanitarian emergencies, which require coordinated action across political boundaries. The normalization of double standards also reshapes global power dynamics. Instead of working toward a rules based international system, states increasingly rely on military strength, economic leverage, and strategic alliances to protect their interests. This shift moves the world away from cooperative frameworks and toward competitive blocs, increasing the risk of misunderstanding, miscalculation, and long term instability. Pressure creates resistance, not cooperation, because human societies and political systems rarely respond positively to coercion. When nations are confronted with threats, sanctions, or public humiliation, Their instinct is not to surrender, but to defend. This defensive reaction strengthens nationalist sentiment and reinforces narratives of external aggression. Leaders under pressure often present themselves as protectors of sovereignty, using foreign hostility to justify tighter control and stronger security measures. Instead of weakening authority, external pressure frequently consolidates power within the very structures it aims to change. Sanctions are commonly promoted as peaceful tools of influence, yet their real world impact often contradicts this expectation. Economic restrictions tend to hurt ordinary citizens far more than political elites. As prices rise and essential goods become scarce, public frustration grows. However, this frustration is not always directed at domestic leadership. In many cases, it is redirected toward the external forces imposing the pressure. This dynamic allows governments to shift blame outward, portraying economic hardship as the result of foreign aggression rather than internal policy failures. Political isolation produces similar outcomes. When countries are excluded from international forums or labeled as global threats, they are pushed toward alternative alliances and parallel economic systems. Instead of integrating into cooperative frameworks, they seek partners who share similar grievances or strategic interests. This fragmentation reduces opportunities for dialogue and increases the formation of rival blocs. The international system becomes more polarized, making compromise more difficult and confrontation more likely. Pressure also alters the internal political landscape of targeted nations. Reform minded groups and moderate voices often lose influence because engagement with external actors becomes politically risky. Anyone advocating negotiation can be accused of disloyalty or weakness. As a result, hardline factions gain prominence, presenting themselves as defenders of national dignity. This shift reduces the space for democratic debate and limits the possibility of gradual, internally driven change. From a psychological perspective, coercion triggers resistance at both individual and collective levels. Communities experiencing sustained pressure develop strong in group identities as a survival mechanism. Cultural pride, historical narratives, and collective memory are emphasized to strengthen social cohesion. While this can foster resilience, it also deepens divisions between nations and reinforces stereotypes. Mutual distrust becomes entrenched, shaping public opinion for generations. Economic pressure also has long term structural effects. Industries adapt by developing informal markets, alternative trade routes, and domestic production strategies. While these adaptations can reduce dependence on external systems, they also decrease transparency and increase inefficiency. Corruption often thrives in restricted environments as limited access to resources creates opportunities for black markets and elite control. These conditions make future integration into the global economy more complex and costly. When pressure becomes the dominant foreign policy tool, it sends a message that negotiation and compromise are secondary. This approach prioritizes short term political gains over long term stability. Instead of building institutions that encourage cooperation, it reinforces a cycle of retaliation and countermeasures. Each new restriction invites a response. Each response justifies further escalation, gradually replacing diplomacy with confrontation as the primary mode of international engagement. True leadership requires diplomacy and restraint because lasting stability cannot be built through intimidation or dominance. When leaders rely on aggressive rhetoric and displays of power, they may appear strong in the short term, but they weaken the foundations of international trust. Diplomacy, by contrast, recognizes that global problems are interconnected and cannot be solved by force alone. It requires patience, negotiation, and the willingness to listen to perspectives that challenge one's own assumptions. Restraint signals maturity in leadership, showing that a nation values long term peace over short term political victories. Diplomatic leadership prioritizes dialogue over threats. It creates channels where disagreements can be managed without escalating into conflict. When governments maintain open communication, even during tense periods, misunderstandings are reduced and opportunities for compromise increase. This approach does not mean ignoring national interests. Rather, it means protecting those interests through cooperation instead of confrontation. Agreements on trade, security, and humanitarian issues are more sustainable when they are built on mutual respect rather than fear. Restraint also plays a critical role in preventing crises from spiraling out of control. In moments of heightened tension, impulsive decisions can trigger irreversible consequences. Leaders who practice restraint understand the weight of their words and actions. They recognize that public statements, military movements, and economic measures send signals that shape global reactions. Responsible leadership involves careful calculation, awareness of unintended consequences, and the ability to step back when emotions and political pressure demand escalation. Another dimension of true leadership is the willingness to invest in global cooperation. Challenges such as climate change, pandemics, food insecurity, and cyber threats cannot be addressed by any single nation. These issues require shared responsibility and coordinated strategies. Diplomatic leadership fosters international partnerships, supports multilateral institutions, and encourages collective problem solving. By strengthening global networks of cooperation, leaders create systems that are more resilient to crises and less vulnerable to unilateral disruption. Domestically, leaders who prioritize diplomacy and restraint set an example for their citizens. They promote values of critical thinking, empathy, and peaceful conflict resolution. This cultural influence shapes public attitudes toward international relations, reducing the appeal of extreme nationalism and fear based politics. When people see their leaders choosing negotiation over hostility, it encourages a more informed and balanced understanding of global affairs. Economic stability is also closely tied to diplomatic leadership. Markets thrive on predictability and trust. When nations maintain stable relationships and avoid sudden confrontations, trade flows more smoothly, investments increase, and economic cooperation expands. Restraint reduces the risk of sudden sanctions, trade wars, and financial shocks that harm workers and businesses. In this way, diplomacy directly contributes to the everyday well being of citizens. True leadership is not measured by how loudly a nation asserts its power, but by how effectively it manages complexity and difference. It requires acknowledging past mistakes, adapting to changing global realities, and prioritizing human security over political ego. Leaders who embrace diplomacy and restraint build credibility not through dominance, but through consistency, reliability, and a commitment to peaceful progress, shaping a global environment where cooperation becomes the norm rather than the exception, and where stability is built through shared responsibility and mutual understanding rather than force and fear